Hello and welcome to the Salt of the Earth podcast. My name is Jonathan Cobb, and this is my co-host,
Thomas.
And today we're here with our 18th episode. So, today we're going to kind of go over...
Today we're going to talk about the Bible.
The Bible, yeah. There's been a lot of different... Between different, faith groups and denominations... And between Jews, Catholics, and evangelicals, there's been different approaches or paradigms through which we see the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
We have different types of relations.
Different perspectives.
Different perspectives on how...
And different uses.
The Jews more... Well, I don't know. It seems...
You can't maybe say because you don't... specifically know any.
I don't know a lot about the Jewish culture, but the point is, based on our beliefs, we see the Bible differently.
People focus on different parts of the Bible, or use the Bible in different ways, or don't use it.
Yeah,
to certain degrees.
And the more modern evangelical culture seems to have a very word for word the Bible is sacred, or I'm not so sure about sacred, but
well,
it is.
It's also sacred. I think a lot of people believe that anyway.
Yeah, they take the Bible very literally, whereas Catholics might be more. The Catholics, from their viewpoint, they're more acceptable or okay with using a little more imagination with it, I think. And Jews more see it as just a law book, maybe.
Well, they specifically focus on the law or the Old Testament.
It's basically in this podcast we're kind of going to talk about what are the different ways the different parts of the Bible apply to us. Because I'm of the viewpoint that we should think about, or should read and study the Old Testament and the New Testament in different contexts, with different reasonings with different approaches.
Mm. Well, as with anything, depending on what you're reading or what goal you have, I guess you have to come at it from slightly different mindset, I guess. So the Old Testament and New Testament being very different, and then split down even further to individual books or types of books. They have kind of different styles, different contexts that will or should at least slightly change how you approach them and what you take from them and how you apply them.
Yeah, because some of the Old Testament is history, and some is prophecy. Well, actually, it's basically just history and prophecy, come to think of it.
And there's wisdom, and there's
poetry. There's poetry, too, yeah. And then the New Testament, some is history of, or what we consider history. You could think of it as a history book.
Mm.
The Gospels and Acts. And a lot of it is letters.
And then epistles, and Revelation could kind of be prophecy, I guess.
And it's kind of weird to think about, because for most of my life, I've never really made a distinction between the epistles and the Gospels. But if I think about it, it's one is a book and the other are just letters that we're eavesdropping on.
Kind of, yeah.
Basically.
But if you look at even Luke was just basically a letter. The Gospel of Luke, because Luke was writing to Theophilus.
Oh.
He says it in the beginning. And also Acts. He says, my dear Theophilus or whatnot.
Mm.
But it was a very, very detailed historical account. It was to a specific person, but it doesn't really come into play. That doesn't matter so much.
Yeah, where the epistles, it's more they were talking to a church about how they can improve and different things that applied to them specifically. And people will say different gospels that are meant for different people groups. But they're all pretty similar.
I wouldn't really say they're for different people groups. I'd just say there's different styles, and you will probably get different things out of different gospels.
Yeah, well, they're written for different. Well, people will say that like they're written for different cultures, or like how like one is written more for Greeks to understand, and you know.
I haven't thought about that much.
Oh, I've heard people say that, but
anyway, so the ways we approach different parts of the Bible. So the clearest, the biggest, I guess, divide in the Bible and what we would apply like different ways, it would be New Testament and Old Testament, right?
mm-hmm.
So in the Old Testament taking up the majority of the Bible, actually, we should ask ourselves exactly how we're going to use it.
Mm-hmm. Well, we should talk about that. But here's just an interesting thing to think about is that the early church, they were a functioning church just like this. They had everything they needed to be church, right?
Mm-hmm.
But yet they did not have any of the New Testament besides like what was the information in the Gospels, but handed down through word of mouth, right?
Yeah, and they would have had the witnesses and the apostles still with them, until the moment when some of the books were written, which different people put different dates on. But there would have been a period of time when they didn't have them, or they didn't have some of them.
Yeah, and so the early church did not have like the benefit of the entire New Testament that we have. But yet they still, instead they had the like word to word, or you know what you just said, eyewitnesses, and the apostles and people that are actually with Jesus. And then they had the New Old Testament, but I feel like they didn't really. It seems like whenever you like see the right or like read the New Testament, how the Old Testament is used by people in the early church is as a reference manual or a supporting book.
Well, yeah, once after Jesus' death, the disciples and everyone started looking to the Old Testament and realizing all the different things that were pointing to and prophesying of him coming and dying. Mm-hmm. And if you read through the Gospels, there's a lot of moments when the writer will like say something to the effect of like, and then they remembered that he said, after he died, they remembered that he said this, and they remembered some prophecy, or they remembered something that he said, and it just kind of all came together. And so they continued doing that and seeing all the things in the Old Testament. And I mean, just like we would today, they were studying through what they had, and they were coming to new conclusions and being like, oh, so they were fulfilling their picture, and it was all making more sense for them because of the new information that Jesus came. The Old Testament had a lot more that they could discover.
Mm-hmm. The Old Testament was kind of a way for them to verify what they've been.
Yeah, and
they once they saw it from a new perspective, they were able to use it to verify the stories that they were hearing about Jesus.
And you see several times in the New Testament where that is shown, like I think like Philip in the Ethiopian eunuch, he's reading the scroll of Isaiah, I think, and then Philip shows him the parts of Isaiah that are talking about Jesus. And then also, I think it's at the end of Acts maybe, is that the Jews in Rome go to Paul to like see if what he's saying has any bearing, and he shows them all the stuff in the Old Testament pointing to Jesus, and they still don't believe. But so that was very much what it was used for, is because, at the time the Jews would have seen the Old Testament or the Torah or whatever they had. They would have seen that as authoritative, right? Mm-hmm. And so how are you going to convince them of it? You go to the thing that they say is authoritative.
Yeah, and so this is how, if you read it this way, you can understand this is what we're saying is true. They're not contradictory, they're complementary. Mm-hmm. But yeah, the early church, the Jews in the early church, they came from the Jewish culture, obviously. And then they saw the Old Testament, parts of the Old Testament is law. Mm-hmm. But when Jesus came, he didn't say, well, the Old Testament no longer has any authority. I feel like he said more along the lines of, we're under a new law, but the Old Testament is, and the Old Testament confirms this, or kind of supports this.
I don't know the place where it is, but I know he says something to the effect of, the Son of Man did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it.
Yeah. It's like, I didn't come to take this down, I came to make it complete.
Mm-hmm. By kind of making it obsolete. So very much the Old Testament was very much quoted in the New Testament. You can see a fair amount of it. So that's how they would have used it early on. How do we use the Old Testament now? I guess if they could segue over to that.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts?
I kind of feel like we need to be more... Well, here's an interesting story. So, like, it wasn't very long ago, or it was a few, probably 5 years ago or so, where I realized there's actually a difference between, the reason that we were a church of the New Testament, and there's actually a distinction there. Because you'll hear about some churches that are Old Testament churches, and then churches that are New Testament churches. Because this guy came to our church, and he was like, he lived by the Old Testament, or for the most part.
Or for kind of.
And my grandpa was like, well, we're a New Testament church. And I was like, oh, I guess we are, aren't we? And I think it's a good thing to make the distinction, because there is a difference between being a New Testament church and an Old Testament church.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, I guess I haven't spoken to too many people who claim to be Old Testament church. I've had friends who were who practiced some form, one or another form of Judaism,
Which is what I'm talking about, basically.
which I guess is what you're talking about. But the way I see it, as far as Christians and Christianity goes, the only Christians are New Testament churches.
Yeah.
The idea of an Old Testament church to me is just something else. It's not really Christianity if Christ is not a core of their belief, which some of them do kind of involve him, I know, but
somebody might consider themselves like an Old Testament Christian if they have Judaism as their moral standards, and then Christ was I don't know, it's hard to explain, but
he was the sacrifice that prevented them from having to give sacrifices anymore.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, so I mean, it is a very good distinction to make, isn't that? You read through the New Testament, and so much of the New Testament, so many of the epistles and everything are devoted to essentially refuting people who are still trying to practice the law in Judaism. There's a huge portion of the New Testament devoted to that and to breaking free from that and not getting so caught up in all the intricacies of the law.
Yeah.
It's pretty clear.
It's God saw that or I'm not sure what his thought process was, obviously, but at some point there was a switch between the way to follow God as a law-based way, and now at some point there's a switch to being a relationship-based way, or a relationship with God is what matters, and not a relationship with the law. Judaism is about relationship with the law, and Christianity is about a relationship with God.
Judaism is about following the law,
yeah,
and then Christianity is about believing in Jesus and
following
him.
Yeah. What it kind of is that both in the Old Testament and the in Christianity, God desires us to live a certain way. But between the New Testament and in Christianity, there's two different methods for us to attain that.
Yeah.
In the Old Testament, it was a law-based morality, where if you follow the rules that are set in front of you, you will be covered and able to be with God. through blood. And in the New Testament, it's about, well, I guess the simplest way to say this is that the Old Testament is about what you did, and the New Testament is about who you are.
Largely, yes.
Right?
There's a shift, and the main shift is the introduction of grace, in that the fact that the law or works never really could save anyone, and that they still can't. Grace is really the core, is that Jesus took all the sin, he took all he kind of took the fall for it, and that is the good news that enables us to have hope nowadays and not be, totally worried about trying to be perfect when we never could be. That being said, the Old Testament still very much has a place, even though things have changed. The Old Testament, we still have the Old Testament. It's not like we just throw it out and burn it.
Yeah.
But I think a good way to know, or to talk about how we should use the Old Testament, is maybe to think about how we shouldn't use it, and then from there you can kind of assume. So what are some ways we should not use the Old Testament?
Probably as a book of law.
As a book of law, so as a list of things we should do. It's not just, we shouldn't just keep going along and say like, oh, well, see, it says it here, and quote some passage in the Old Testament and say that, and then try to hold people accountable to that.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that we never do and never have done. Like, as far as the Christian culture is, like, if you had to spend time outside of camp, if you are unclean for some weird,
and if you steal, or if you dishonor your parents or something like that, then you need to be stoned.
There's a lot of stuff in there.
There's a lot of stuff like that, and I guess we'll talk about that in a moment. But so I guess along the same lines of that, as something you should not use with the Old Testament, is you should not use it to either justify or condemn a certain thing by itself. So you can't look up a passage in the law and say, see, this says such and such a thing is wrong, because if you're just looking at the Old Testament alone and trying to make a case off that, that's it's an extremely weak case, because then, someone could ask you, okay, well, why don't you follow all of the Old Testament, right? Mm-hmm. And then you have to say, oh, well, then you either have to say, oh, well, I only follow certain parts of it, and you're just, being picky and choosy, or you have to come up with some other reason, and it's just poor practice. It's bad logic too.
Yeah.
And once you start picking and choosing sections of the Bible that you will or will not follow, then what's the point? You're just, what more can be done? Like, if you're going to do that, then why even use the Bible? Let's see, any other things? I think really those are kind of the core of, like, don't use the Old Testament as, this is the way I should live, this is what I should do or should not do. I think that's the core of what we shouldn't do with the Old Testament.
Yeah. And I guess to switch over to what the Old Testament is for, in my opinion, the main reason we should read the Old Testament is to work to understand the heart of God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the thing. A lot of people would. I've heard that a lot of people say that is, you can definitely see the heart of God a lot in the Old Testament. And something to keep in mind is that while it may on the very surface level look like God's behaving a lot differently and things are a lot different in Old and New Testament, it's the same God, and He hasn't changed.
It just strategies have changed.
The God in the Old Testament is the same God in the New Testament, and maybe He doesn't necessarily as overtly open up the earth and swallow people up or things like that, but He's the same God. He's doing something different. That doesn't mean He's changed. He's the same God. So
still desires the same things from us.
He still desires the same thing. He still wants us choose him and to follow him and to seek righteous lives.
Mm-hmm.
And so when a lot of people say, I've heard it multiple times, that the Old Testament they read it to know the heart of God, and that's a great reason to read it, because you read through like the Psalms or something, and a lot of it's, David or some other psalmist speaking, but they it shows you how they're talking to God and how they revere him, and they take all their joy in him, and they go to him with their sorrows. Or a lot of other books, you'll see sometimes bit by bit and sometimes in big chunks, this is who God is. And as you mentioned, knowing who God is and so we can follow him is a major part of the new covenant,
Mm-hmm.
That's something we need to do.
Yeah. Yeah, because God is the same God in both books, both the Old Testament and the New Testament. Even though God uses different laws or covenants in the two testaments, he still is the same. He still is the same God. He still wants the same things from us. He still has the same attributes. He just has different ways he just uses different methods to do things, I guess. In the Old Testament, he used physical things to influence people. In the New Testament, he uses more under grace, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, in the Old Testament, if we didn't obey God, might be swallowed up in a big hole in the ground or something like that. Or die of thirst or something.
Or serpents, or
Yeah.
any number of things.
In the New Testament, in the New Covenant, God's not going to likely strike us dead if we disobey him. We face eternal wrath.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, and we have the knowledge now of how to live to not face eternal wrath.
Mm-hmm. I think, so yeah, the Old Testament is a lot more about things you do, but I know there's several moments when it kind of comes through that, even back then, God is still wanting the heart behind it. He's not just wanting people to do things. He's wanting the heart. So like, I think of like when Samuel told Saul, after Saul had saved back a bunch of the finest cattle and stuff when he was supposed to kill them, Samuel said, to obey is better than sacrifice. And so things like that, there's kind of little bits where it comes through where it still shows God still wanted their hearts back then. He didn't just want them following a list. Another thing I think that the Old Testament should be used for is showing people what it is like if religion is a law, is a bunch of physical checklists, or even if they're not physical. If it's a bunch of checklists, a bunch of things you have to do, the Old Testament shows you how that
worked out,
how that goes, or how it didn't work out really.
Yeah.
So like I think like right now in the youth group we're going through Judges, and Judges is the book of how Israel miserably failed again and again and again. And it's because they turned away from God and did what was right in their own eyes. And because they didn't have a righteous king. Really, I keep thinking as I go through this is that the Judges is really kind of a book of, it's not just about Israel, it's about people in general. And it's even about us. It's because when we try to do things our own way, we go through a similar pattern as Israel, where we sin, fall away, eventually cry out to God for help, and then, go in that whole cycle that they do in Israel and Judges. It's kind of the same way with us. And Judges shows how spectacularly that fails, because toward the end of the book, things get really dark. Israel has essentially become as bad or worse than all the other nations around them, when they're supposed to be God's people. So Judges is just one example, but as a whole, the Old Testament shows what happens when we have a specific law to follow. It's like, because I know the temptation is always there, even nowadays, that We just wish there was a few things we could do, and as long as we did those things, we would know, we made it, But it's not actually good.
Yeah.
It's not good. It doesn't work because
we're very prone to making mistakes.
I mean, you just look in Genesis, and it took them 3 chapters to break the one rule they were given.
Yeah.
And so, come on now. You're really thinking that if we had a list of rules that we would do better than they did?
Mm-hmm.
I would, I'd like to think so, but probably not.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, definitely not. Really, the Old Testament, when combined with the New Testament, that's the only way you can get the complete picture. Because if you just look at the Old Testament too much by itself, you're gonna, and you don't remind yourself of what happens in the New Testament, then it's kind of like, why is this happening? It seems pointless. The New Testament definitely gives completion to it all.
Yeah, it's like the Old Testament is the setup, is the context. The New Testament is the resolution.
Mm-hmm. And very much the Old Testament was to show that there was a better way needed, that there was a way that was better than the law and then sacrifices. There needed to be another way to be justified, and in walks Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah, and so that brings us to the New Testament. So the New Testament, by contrast, is not a book of law. There is really no real law in it. There's no list of rules, really. Right?
There definitely are commandments throughout, but they're not as dogmatic, and they're in a very different context than they are in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
Whereas it's not like, do this bad thing and you're unclean for 7 days, or do this and you get stoned, or it's not at all like that. It's very much Jesus and then the apostles who are inspired saying, this is what you should do. Pretty much. They're saying, here's what you should do. Here's what you should be like. If you're not 100% perfect, it's okay, but you need to be working towards that, That's very much the kind of the idea I get from the commandments that are in the New Testament.
Well, I think I have a good example of what I'm talking about as far as the New Testament not being a book of law, but a book of encouragement, or kind of guidance, would be the Sermon on the Mount.
Mm-hmm.
If this is how you should live, this is the qualities that please God.
Mm-hmm. And the overwhelming majority, well, really the whole Sermon on the Mount pretty much is not focusing on doing things, but on rather being certain things, or embodying certain quantities. So you just look at the Beatitudes, meek, man, I should really know these better. Meek, peacemakers, hunger and thirst for righteousness, things like these. Those are not at all do this,
it's not like the Old Testament's do this or this happens to you. It's you should be this way because
Mm-hmm.
you will be blessed.
And going on, he mentions things like, you have heard it said, do not commit adultery, and then he instead says, he kind of brings all the, several old commandments more into, issues of the spirit, of the attitude. Mm-hmm. So he says, well, even whoever looks at a woman with lust commits adultery with her in her heart. So he's taking away from, okay, just the mere physical act of sinning, and he's saying, okay, sin is actually much more in the mind than through acts.
Mm-hmm.
And
he's going back a layer. He's just because you didn't physically do something that you're committed not to doesn't mean doesn't make you a good person, or doesn't make you righteous. doesn't make you holy or whatever. Because, yeah, the New Testament's it's more about who we are, and being righteous is part of that. More than just avoiding certain things.
Yeah, and yeah, the Sermon on the Mount is a good example because that whole sermon is very much just, it's him taking old commandments and things like that and kind of giving a picture of what this new way of living is like, and it's very much more focused on spirit, on attitude, on following God. It's more like a heart-focused thing rather than a action-focused thing.
Yeah. And yeah, so there's the Spirit on the Mount. That's like probably one of the best. It's like or the Sermon on the Mount is like Jesus' main sermon for the Christians.
It's a very big sermon, yes.
Yeah. And then, but Jesus' whole life was an example for us as well.
Mm-hmm.
It was something for us to learn from. Because if we're going to the Old Testament or the New Testament to find rules for how we should live, I think we're approaching it wrong. We should be going to the New Testament to look for an example for us to follow.
Mm-hmm.
Because rules don't cover everything. A person...
Well, it comes down to there's no rule for how you can love. There's no one rule for how you can be a peacemaker, things like this. They're not... You can't really govern those by rules, but you can give examples of how you love, or how you make peace or how you find unity.
Yeah, we should do these things the way Jesus would have done it.
And at the same time, there are definitely commands mixed in because Jesus does say love one another as I have loved you and things like that. So but it's very different. It's not like the commands are not like laws. They are. They're very much... The shift is from law to spirit, very much.
Mm-hmm.
And, I mean, last time we talked about maturing spiritually, and I brought up several passages where it very much lists, like, here are good qualities you should have, and it's not lists of, do good to the poor or, do all it's not lists of things you can do of outward signs. It's lists of things like, be kind, be gentle, be loving most of all, things like that. So, and those very much show you, and especially I think of like the passage in, I want to say 1 Peter, where he even says, do these things and you will not be unfruitful. You do these things and the entry into the kingdom of heaven will be richly supplied. So that goes to show you that the kind of requirements we have are very different, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The kind of a good contrast between the Old Testament and the New Testament, or in the Gospel specifically. Now, I think there's another contrast that should be made between the Gospels and the Epistles. I've been thinking about this more recently. Is like we don't need the Epistles to rule our church or to decide how we run our church. The epistles are nice to have, but they're not necessary. And the reason I know this is because the early church started a church without the epistles.
Yeah.
And obviously it wasn't perfect, and that's why they had letters of Reformation. But
it is also a little bit of a different situation there. So you can't necessarily just say they didn't have the epistles, therefore you don't need the epistles. They had firsthand witnesses, and they had, prophets and people very much, active in those days. But there is, well, we'll put it this way, is you definitely can get everything you would need to know about salvation from the Gospels.
yeah,
You don't need to go beyond that. But that we should be careful not to say something like that to devalue all the epistles and everything, because they are still equally inspired. It's not like,
yeah,
I'll just take the Gospels and I'll focus on those and then I'll forget the rest. There's still very good information in the epistles. But maybe some more care has to be taken with those, because the epistles were written to people who would, at least most of them, to churches who had messed up in some way.
well, they were in specific situations.
They were into specific situations, and a lot of them they also have broad advice and things. There are things for specific situations, which we can also learn from, because a lot of times the churches nowadays will go through similar situations.
Yeah. And the reason I bring this up is because it can be easy to try to base decisions in how our church runs completely off the epistles and forget that it doesn't need to be that. It's not that complicated. Our whole thing is we're disciples of Christ, and to be a disciple, you just need to know Christ, and all that is in the Gospels.
Mm-hmm.
And to know God, and that's in the Old Testament and the whole Bible. But because as Christians, our goal is to follow Christ, and that's in the Gospels, and so the epistles are not what we should be looking to for. We shouldn't view the epistles as the New Testament law.
Well, we should not view anything in the New Testament as law. But, so I guess I kind of see what you're saying is that, well, if we were trying to figure out, how, if we wanted our, the church to operate the way, Jesus would want it, as best as it could be, is being careful as to looking solely to the epistles for it. Is at least what I gather.
Yeah.
About what you're saying is that, yeah. So I can definitely see that, because, well, like I said, a lot of the epistles were written to churches who had in one or another way messed up.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we were to look at those churches and then specifically follow their example, the danger would be that we would also follow some of the ways that they messed up.
And the reason I bring this up is because I feel like a lot of churches do this.
Yeah.
But it's like we're trying to base our church off of people that base their church off of Jesus' teachings. Why don't we just go straight to the source?
Yeah, definitely.
It's no,
Well, it's just like nowadays, if someone, is discipling someone or someone, they might, if they're not careful, they might point that other person to themselves or to their particular church or denomination rather than pointing them straight to Jesus.
yeah.
And things should always be pointed straight to Jesus. The epistles are still, they have examples of what to do right or what to do wrong, I guess is how I would look at them.
They talk about, go over more smaller details and
there's definitely, so if I was going to try to base something, try to decide how this is how a church should go, definitely the Gospels would be at the forefront, and Jesus' example of what he did with his disciples, which was, fairly small groups, lots of one-on-one and stuff. And then going from that, I think the second best example would be found right at the beginning of Acts. Is the first 7 chapters or so, because at that point, this is right after people have the Holy Spirit has been poured out on the disciples and on the apostles, I should say, and this is people are loving each other and having a kind of unity that sounds kind of crazy to us today if you read those chapters. I look at that and I see like that's a pretty good picture of what we should be like, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not, at that point, there haven't been as many mistakes made as later on in some of the churches in the epistles. The argument could still be made, you know, that early church is still trying to follow Jesus, and so if we try to follow that early church, we're adding another link in the chain. But really, to me, the first few chapters of Acts is like, again, it's not perfect, but it's as close to a pretty good idea of what I think a church should be like as you can get.
Yeah.
So usually when I say like I want to follow the example of the early church, I'm usually more having in mind, you know, the church right from the beginning in Acts, rather than, I don't have in mind like the church at Laodicea or something,
Yeah.
or the church at Corinth. I don't have that in mind as the early church. Yes, it was still early, but when I say like, as far as for the purposes of like emulating the early church, I'm more thinking like right from the beginning, that first example of how much unity they had. That's more like what I would want to follow. And I think that's because at that time they had all the apostles in one place, and they were pretty well doing, the apostles were pretty well showing everyone the way Jesus had taught them. And then it kind of, as the apostles spread out and as, you know, people have get kind of confused on certain issues, then things get more muddled. But
yeah, and so all the whole Bible has different purposes. It's the main thing we need to be aware of is that we should try to be aware of that, or we shouldn't try to get our information through like secondhand ways, as we should use like the Old Testament supports the New Testament, the epistles support the gospel. But the main thing we should be focusing on is how Jesus lived, and then use the Old Testament to support that, and the New Testament and the epistles and stuff to support that, instead of vice versa. Instead of trying to base our life off of the early church and then having Jesus' example be secondary.
Yeah. Well, I heard. Well, I guess I've read it in a couple different books, but the idea, or that is in advice one preacher had to another, or maybe it was in seminary school or something. But the idea was never preach a sermon that would be true if Jesus didn't die on the cross. Essentially having the idea of like, if the reality of the gospel and what Jesus did makes no impact to what you're saying, like this, to this sermon, or, you know, it could go to apply to other instances or other areas as well. If it has no bearing, then you need to change how you're presenting that sermon, I guess, you know. It's an interesting thought because it highlights, you know, really Jesus is the core, the gospel is the core of Christianity.
Yeah.
You can't escape it, and I think we can always bear to focus more on that than we do. There's really no focusing too much on that, except I guess I would say if you are invalidating or devaluing like the other areas of like the New Testament, for instance, that's going too far, but it's also going too far to focus solely on the early church and kind of forget how big of a part Jesus plays in it.
Well, Jesus was the foundation of that.
Well, yeah, and
Jesus was the example for that, and the early church is based off of Jesus.
And actually, foundation is a really good word because,
yeah.
Well, even Paul uses that imagery of Jesus being the foundation or
the cornerstone.
And then we are just built on top of that. Make sure you're built on top of it, right? You can build on top of another foundation in theory, or only partially built on Jesus, and that doesn't work.
Yeah. We should like the whole like analogy of like the cornerstone. We shouldn't try to align our stone of our faith on like another one of the stones. We should try to align ourselves with the cornerstone.
Which is something I'm seeing more and more, is that we can't align ourselves to any particular faction or group or party of any sort, and so I'm talking about like within denominations or different things like that, or political parties or different groups like this. Is the less you align yourself with that kind of stuff, the better, because ultimately we should be aligned with Jesus and him alone, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so
that's the only way to achieve unity.
And it's the only way to achieve unity is if you're focused on Jesus, on what he did, and then some of the other finer details are less important to you,
Yeah.
Because I know growing up, and I've seen it so many times, that it's so often a barrier what church you go to or what denomination you are, and it's very easy to come into the mindset that since your church or denomination is more correct or something, just because that's what you were indoctrinated as a kid, that other people who are confessing Christians, they're somehow inferior or something, and that's right there, unity gone.
Yeah.
And more I'm seeing that true unity comes from separating yourself from that stuff. And I guess that goes along with what we're talking about, because ultimately the whole Bible is made to point towards Jesus,
Mm-hmm.
if you really think about it. And so he's always the center. And so no matter how you're studying whatever part of the Bible you're studying, you have to be thinking of how it goes in context with that, right?
Yeah, like you could think of like the Bible as you could think of like the Bible as any other type of book or story. The Old Testament is the build up in the context.
Jesus is the climax.
Jesus is the climax, and then the like the New Testament or like the epistles and stuff is like the effect of the climax.
And building up towards the second climax, which hasn't happened yet.
Oh, that's right. It's a double climax, isn't it?
Yeah.
So it's not like a normal story, but anyway.
It's already told us that the second one is coming, though, right?
Yeah. So it's a dual climax story, but
not to devalue the first climax. It was pretty big.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I feel like we've only given like the barest overview of talking about different parts of the Bible and things. We're definitely not how to put this?
Scholarized?
We're not very scholarly, for sure. You could split this up into so many parts and spend so much time on it. We covered like Old Testament and then New Testament split into Gospel and Epistle. Really, there's so many more splits you could do, and really the key is, whether it be Testament or book or chapter or verse, you have to be thinking about the context and what goes around it and how it works into the whole, right?
Yeah.
The more you get tunnel vision, the more likely you are to get a different view than the correct one. Mm-hmm. I guess that's kind of a good overview of of how to use or study any part of the Bible. Is part of the whole.
Mm-hmm. It's one big story that all works together, and it's all serves a purpose.
Mm-hmm.
It's either
The verse to close on is definitely 2 Timothy 3:16 through 17. All Scripture is inspired by God and profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, for training in righteousness, so that the man of God may be adequate, equipped for every good work. There you have it. May be adequate, equipped for every good work. That's what we want to be, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's it for episode 18. Any closing thoughts, Jonathan?
Well, this has been something it's a fun topic to talk about, I think. It's good to think about this more, I guess.
Yeah.
It's actually mostly Ruben that got me thinking about this, to be
Yeah.
honest.
Some of the things you were saying were very much things that sounded like they came from him.
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
all right. So that's good. Episode 18. It's a wrap. What?
I was just going to remind you
Oh, you're reminding me of what?
to do your thing.
Oh, well, maybe I wasn't wanting to do my thing. So we talked about the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew chapter 5, which has some very interesting verses about being salty in it. But ultimately, when we think about what it means to be salty, we talked about the Beatitudes and the rest of the Sermon on the Mount, and being salty is a spiritual condition. It's who you are. It's not so much what you do. And so reading this here, the purpose of the scripture is to equip every man of God to be adequate and equipped for every good work. That right there sounds to me like a salty person, right?
Yep.
This is all a roundabout way of saying that the Bible is the way you figure out how to be a salty person.
So
we want to be salt of the earth. You should want to be salt of the earth, and the Bible is the way that you be salty.